Hello everybody. I found a program that allows me to record my screen, so I'm trying this as a kind of a different way of doing things. This video focuses on a philosophical argument for the Trinitarian worldview, and I will be, in doing so, I will be using three words: intellect, emotions, and will. These three words are usually, when one looks at personality, these three words often pop up. Sometimes there's different words used for them, like for intellect. You can have thoughts, feelings for emotions, or volition for will, or whatever. But normally, there's a lot of things that I'm sure are entailed in personality. But philosophically speaking, intellect, emotions, and will are almost usually considered involved. So we're going to look at intellect, emotions, and will. So at the end of this video, I'm going to want to look at these four questions, so I want to bring them up now. Does God have personality? Does God have intellect? Does God have emotions? And does God have will? But before we get there, I would like to go through a thought process with you. So I like to go through a thought exercise with you. And the thought exercise I want to go through is I want you to imagine a world in which there are no relationships. Now when I say no relationships, I don't just mean relationships among persons. Because like when you're driving a car, you're having a relationship with the steering wheel, with the shifter, with the gas pedal, brake pedals, radio, everything, windshield wipers, all that good stuff. So you're having relationships when you're driving a car. Even when you're sleeping, you're having a relationship with the pillow, the blanket, the bed, the sheets, temperature in the room, the lightness or darkness in the room, so on and so forth. So no matter what you do, you are in a world which is drenched in relationships. So I want you, as best as you can, to imagine a world in which there are absolutely no relationships. In such a world in which there are no relationships, things would be basically frozen. Anything that you do, if you function, you're having relationships. So it would have to be pretty much a functionless, frozen world. So in such a world, would intellect have meaning? Would it have value? What are you going to have thoughts about if there are no relationships? It's an intrinsic thing, but what value are your thoughts if you can't express them? And you can't do anything about them, and they don't allow you to do anything because you are functionless. This is a non-relationship world we're talking about. So intellect has no value and meaning if it can survive in a relationship-less world. And then emotions, what value and meaning would emotions have? What are you going to have feelings about if there are no relationships? Again, this would be an intrinsic thing, but it is, you can't express it. In order to express it, you would have to have relationships. In such a world, will couldn't possibly exist because relationships are an act of will. So intellect, emotions, and will and personality could not exist in a world in which there are no relationships. Or if they could exist, they would be completely void of value and meaning. Thus, we can conclude that intellect, emotion, and will are intrinsic to a person, relational qualities, expressive qualities, and they appear to be meaningless in isolation. So now I would like to imagine another world, a world in which God never created a single thing. In such a world in which God never created a single thing, there is no creation. Does God have personality? Does God have intellect? Does God have emotions? Does God have will? If the answer to these questions are yes, then whom or with what is God having relationship with? In such a world in which God never created a single thing, and such a world had to have existed at some point, because creation occurred at some point, and therefore prior to that, and I don't know if you can really use the word prior there because time didn't exist prior to time existing, but however you want to word it, such a world had to have existed. And in such a world, intellect, emotions, and will would have to be internal to God, which we've already demonstrated that it's internal to persons anyway, but it would have to be internal to God. So what relationships are going on internal to God? A uni-personal God couldn't have an intellect, emotions, or will. And if such a God did, they would be meaningless. They would be empty. His intellect would be useless. His emotions would be useless. And I think it's rather obvious he couldn't have a will, because if there's no relationships going on internal to God, will implies relationships imply will, and will implies relationships. So a unipersonal God cannot have intellect, emotions, and will. A multi-personal God, or in my view, a tri-personal God, could very easily have all these things. In fact, I think the best foundation for looking at these things, for looking at personality, philosophically, would be the tri-personal or Trinitarian worldview, because it is the Trinitarian worldview that leaves God as being not unipersonal. Any worldview that leaves God as unipersonal would end up failing philosophically and explaining personality and how it could work, because a unipersonal God couldn't have these things. So there you have it. One more thing we might as well look at if we have time. In Exodus 3:14, God's response to Moses when Moses asks, "Who am I to say you are?" God says, "I am that I am." He says, "I am." So God is telling us here that he is his own point of reference. You, on the other hand, you have multiple various points of reference. For example, right now you're a person watching this video, probably in front of a desk and probably in front of a computer. So the relationships that you have in your heavy, drenched relationship world that you live in give you constantly points of references. However, God himself, he has only one point of reference, and that would be God. God is his own point of reference. So God's relationships must be internal to himself. Now, to say that God is his own point of reference, however, is actually an absurd thought, unless there are actual persons, multi-persons, that can refer to each other. And so internally, the tripersonal God in the tripersonal worldview can actually best explain God being his own point of reference. A unipersonal God would have a hard time, I would think, being his own point of reference. Again, we are talking about a world in which God never created a single thing. So in order to have a point of reference, you have to have relationships going on. So God, to be his own point of reference, would have to have relationships internal to himself. Now, we can get silly here and say that God is making himself lunch, and that's his relationship status, or he's sleeping in a bed or something like that, but of course that's obviously not true. So God, to be his own point of reference and having relationships internal to himself, it has to be amongst multiple persons. It cannot be a physical thing, because God is not physical, God is spiritual. So there you have it. You know, the Unitarians and the oneness, I call them modalists, but oneness Christians, you guys remind me of Doubting Thomas. It's basically what you are. You're Doubting Thomases. And sooner or later, you're going to have to make the decision to put the finger in the wound and exclaim, "My Lord, my God," to Jesus. It seems to me that if you believe Jesus is somebody other than what he is and who he is, then your salvation may be at stake. So this is a very important issue. So I'll just leave you with that thought, and thank you for watching, and God bless.